and you're in pain, soothing as a springtime rain, to have a friend right in your corner, your heart will feel a little warmer. Tender loving care, tender loving care, each warm and friendly touch lets someone know you care so much. Tender loving care, tender loving care.
Good evening, I'm Dr. Greenbrier Allman. Thank you for joining us on our program, Tender Loving Care. Each week on Channel 3, I'm happy to talk about this interface between Christianity and medicine. And tonight I'm going to be opening up a topic that will continue over the summer, actually, and end when I give a public presentation for the Forensic Mondays on September the 9th. I'll be talking about suicide. And there's much to be said about that topic, and I'll have to distill it all down into an hour-and-a-half program for the public. If you're interested in that topic or other forensic topics, that's an ongoing program here in our community, and it's an honor for me to be thought of as an expert or someone who can contribute to that discussion. And I'll be talking about suicide, as I say, on September the 9th. But I wanted to sort of pick up the ball and talk about suicide now, and particularly with firearms, since this has been a recent discussion. This goes back, if you will, to at least Connecticut, and last December at Newtown, when this young man, we don't know anything about his mental condition or what was inside his head, but just from the news, he certainly, it was a horrific act. He killed over 20 children. He killed 6 or so adults, and then he killed himself. So it's a murder-suicide, and it gave us a chance to look at the issue of suicide and guns. Of course, homicide and guns, too. And want to just share some statistics and some things that have come to light about this, and what do we really know about this combination? Well, first of all, and I consider it a privilege to take care of people who suffer depression or other forms of mental illness, and I have found over the years that the mentally ill, those who may be suffering depression or anxiety or post-traumatic stress disorder, if they're combat veterans that I treat at the VA, those folks are the ones who have been hurt, overwhelmed, and are not really harmful to others, and mostly not harmful to themselves. If you want to think about it this way, there's 4% of all violent acts, including suicide as a violent act, if you define it forensically, are committed by those who have any type of diagnosis as mentally ill, and certainly that leads to 96% of all the violent acts being committed by people who don't have a diagnosis of mental illness. So the preponderance is that people who may be suffering don't hurt others and don't hurt themselves. And in my practice over the years, I've had very few people who actually came for help. They volunteered, they came for help. And they knew there was a stigma to identifying themselves, and not in my eyes, but maybe to their family or the community, and they came for help, and very few have ever committed suicide. And so I'm grateful for that over 43 years. Having said all that, there's lessons that we can learn, and we need to look at that. With firearms and guns involved, some 17,000 people in the United States every year will kill themselves with firearms. And there's about 13,000 people die of homicidal death with firearms. So over 30,000 people are dying in this country due to firearms. And so the question then comes, as we had the recent debate, should we be doing anything about firearm registration or the ability to screen people because of mental illness? what's the forensics on that? That will be sort of my topic when I finally get to September, trying to put this all together. But just to share some thoughts, preliminary thoughts tonight. Well, first of all, in the military, we have some 21 people every day who are certainly trained to use weapons who are committing suicide. This is a tragedy, and we've been fighting a war. Many men and women have been deployed more than once to Afghanistan or Iraq, and usually, if you analyze the suicide, this is on a multiple deployment situation. Maybe the fourth or fifth time they're about to be deployed is when they will commit suicide. So there's a pattern there, and usually it's a weapon, a gun or something like that is used. So it's a lethal attempt. Women are usually 10 times more likely to try to kill themselves than men. But men are about 10 times more effective in killing themselves because they use the lethal weapons and like guns, and women will end up using pills to overdose and so forth, usually don't die. Now, the suicide, as I mentioned, can be prevented, and one of the discussions is we've had the news about Connecticut and other things like out in Arizona when the Congress lady was shot, other things like this. It raises the prospect that there's mental illness involved, and I want to put that to rest. In violent deaths, like mass deaths when more than one person is killed, this is only 0.1% of all the violent deaths. So this is not a big deal. I mean, there's still 99.9 non-violent deaths that have nothing to do with mass killing, have nothing to do with weapons, and nothing to do with mental illness. So this is a rare event, but of course it gets in the news, and then we start to think about it. Growing up in West Virginia, of course, and I'll talk about my own experience, and not about patients per se, but just my own experience growing up. Most of us learned how to use weapons. I remember being taught by neighbors, and my parents understood this, and we were shooting cans off of the top of a fence and using proper firearm safety, and nothing ever happened bad. Going hunting for groundhogs or squirrels or deer, this is something that we have done here in the mountains, and we didn't. Once in a while there were accidents, but nothing that I ever knew about personally. But anyway, firearms have been used safely by people, and of course beyond that we have the right to bear arms. And concern that I have when discussions come up, like should we ban assault weapons? Should we register everyone who may be mentally ill, and should we keep them from owning a weapon, or whatever the law as proposed? This does several things to the patients I'm taking care of, and one is that first of all they will keep them away from the doctor. I mean, why come to a doctor? This is common sense. Why come to a doctor if the doctor's going to have to ask a question about a firearm or suicide by firearm, or do you own a firearm, and then that information is going to be registered because the doctor asked it? That would keep people away. I mean, if I had to go to see my dentist, for example, and I had to tell my dentist things that had nothing to do with my tooth care, in my estimation, then I probably would stay away from my dentist. I mean, there's a stigma anyway to going to get health care, to be sick, and so if we tie a law to the doctor's office that they have to get information for the federal government, then information, not only will information not be gained, but probably people would stay away from their doctor. The other thing that will happen is there's already under-treatment of mental illness. Most people who are suffering delusional disorder, all the people who are homeless, on and on, you can hear of people who are not getting help for their mental illness. This would only increase if we make the stigma worse. If we tie, as they do in many newscasts, tie the event of suicide or homicide or both to mental illness and portray that person as dangerous who may have mental illness, when in fact it's the opposite. But it'll keep people away from getting care that they need, and in all likelihood increase the suffering of mental illness. Now, the other thing that we do want to say, and I think we can say this for the Forensics Monday in September, is that separate from mental illness, most people who die in an accident, car accident, or people who are dying of overdose death in West Virginia at an epidemic portion, or people who are committing crimes, or people who are committing suicide and using weapons, most people are loaded with alcohol when they do that. Maybe the second thing is benzodiazepines. The third thing is opioids. So drugs and alcohol are a dangerous thing in our society, and that's separate from mental illness. If we want to begin thinking about how to prevent a lot of this stuff, then we need to treat effectively those people who abuse drugs, abuse alcohol, but not necessarily, again, restrict firearms. There is no statistic that says that we could that we can even prevent this, either by magazine size or by limiting who owns it and by registration. Now, President Obama has, since the Newtown massacre, has asked Congress for money to do research. And so there'll be longitudinal studies. There have been 18 states who study the violent crimes in their state, but that of course means that there have been a large number of states. What would that be? 28 states who don't study that type of thing, or 32 states who don't study that. So. But now the federal government will be looking at all violent deaths and gathering data on that, and that's okay. We probably need to know more about that. I think out of studying traffic accidents and things like that, so we probably ended up with a seatbelt law, realizing that seatbelts would save lives. We have a helmet law for children riding a bike, because riding a bike and with a helmet on, if you have an accident, you limit concussion injuries and head injuries and traumatic brain injury, and that's a good thing. So it's okay, in my mind, to study a situation like this, a violent death, and try to figure out what could have been done, what could help. Let's come back to suicide, though, for now, and look at hotlines. This is where, when I came into the community after growing up here, came back as a doctor to practice, I became aware of Contact Teleministries. This was a Christian ministry, and it was a 24-hour telephone hotline, and people could call in with whatever concerns they have. They could get information, and we established actually the parish house and the information referral service that represents in our community. That came out of a Christian concern when I was first coming to practice. And we trained at that time about 70 volunteers, and I'm sure many of them have died or passed on. Things have happened. Probably some of them are still volunteering at the parish house today. Bless their souls. But that ministry began with the idea that we could get information and referral together to help people who were suffering, and they could call, they could get help. They didn't have to identify themselves necessarily by name over the telephone, and certainly if they did present for help, they'd have to give ID and things like that, depending on the agency they went to, but the information was going to be there for them. The other thing that came out of that for me was, as a doctor, realizing that people would call in anonymously to Contact Teleministries and would say, I'm thinking about hurting myself. We break this into 4 parts. There's the idea, people have that they may want to hurt themselves. They may then dwell on it and think about it a lot, or more and more, and then they may have an intention to do it, given the opportunity. Maybe they're going to stockpile weapons or stockpile pills or whatever the intention is. They're planning for it, and then finally the plan. When's it going to happen, and how they're going to do it particularly. So there's 4 stages, and lo and behold, when people will talk on the telephone or in a doctor's office or an emergency room or wherever they enter the healthcare system, if they talk for as little as 15 minutes, only 15 minutes really, they will begin to sort of talk themselves out of suicide. So that's why suicide hotlines work. A great way to prevent suicide. That's why when people come to a doctor, we're taught to let the person describe why they're there, their chief complaint, and give them time and space. If someone is in a doctor's office, we usually have a protocol like this. It's not sneaky, but it's just the way we do it. Different people will begin to ask people questions, and so the safest person to ask the question initially about suicide is usually not even a doctor or a nurse. It may be just a secretary or someone, or people filling out information on a chart, and in there'll be questions about suicide. Have you thought of hurting yourself? Have you been depressed? Have you been down in the dumps? Have you been more blue? I mean, questions like this. Do you feel safe? That's an open-ended question. People interpret that in different ways. But beginning the process of entering the healthcare system, having a questionnaire, and then having someone just check the answers just for completeness. Let's see, Mrs. Smith, if you had any difficulty with this form, and let's see what information you put down there, and go over that with the person. And lo and behold, sometimes people will begin to identify that they want to deal with an issue like an intention or a plan or an idea about suicide. Now, talking to veterans, and I do this every day, or have over the years, and I would hear that people in a battle situation will, of course, not have mental health services, but they do have chaplains, and so Christian ministers, Jewish, Muslim faith, all the chaplains may represent different faiths, but for my purpose, my interest is a Christian chaplain, hearing from people and having an open-ended conversation about the gift of life, and of course the nobleness of being patriotic, serving our country, defending our family, freedom, topics that people have a high idealism about, justice, freedom, the American way, and this will lead to discussions about suicide, and so chaplains are a good place to enter the system. Now, the church has moved to the edge of our society in some ways, and I can see this in the last 43 years, because when I first came to town, in order just to screen people, because I obviously could not take care of everyone, I asked that the people who I would see would be referred by their pastor. They could also by a doctor, but they couldn't just walk in off the street. They had to come by way of referral. And so I was getting many people from churches, and that was good. I enjoyed that. I was helping them, and while I wasn't trying to exclude other people, I just, as one doctor in town dealing with psychiatry, I couldn't do all of that. So that was worked out. People were involved at their church. Now go forward of some 43 years, and I have seen a pattern. The last 7 years I was practicing up at Rock Cave, and then 5 years down here at Appalachia Community Health Center. I was aware that that people were not going to church. We take a little spiritual inventory, again, as people come, and so the first 500 kids that I had registered at Rock Cave, I realized as I look back, there were only about 5 of them that were involved in a church. If I were waiting for referrals from ministers in, say, 2005, I would have been starving. The ministers probably did not know the situation of most of the people I was taking care of because they were not involved in a church. So the church, as I say, has moved to the periphery, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a central role to understand about the importance of life. Well, let's talk a little bit again, not to ramble too much, but about a study that was done, and this sparked my interest since I'm preparing for this Forensics Monday coming up in September. This was a study that was about attitudes toward people with serious mental illness and gun control policies. This is in the American Journal of Psychiatry, and this is the issue that just came today for me, the May 2013 issue. And I just want to go to the discussion part because I think that's the highlight here. They proposed a number of ways that we can understand what's happening to people when they begin to talk of death and about either hurting other people or hurting themselves. The news portrayals, obviously the media, have a great deal to do with our attitudes. We glue ourselves to the TV and we listen to what's happening, and it goes on and on and on. And you know how intense that is. Most people are well aware of what's happening. The news around a mass shooting may be perceived differently, and indeed sometimes there's a liberal bias. We talked about there's a conservative bias. There's bias of various types, and so people get different ideas. With regards to mental illness and events like this, as long as we have once in a while, though it's very rare, a mentally ill person who's committing the violence, then that goes right to the top. And so 70% of the people surveyed in this media survey for this article have a negative attitude about the mentally ill, that is a stigma about the mentally ill, and an idea that they're violent. Now, yes, there are the delusional person on the street, homeless, who may look violent, and once in a while that of course adds to the stigma. Or if someone who's mentally ill hurts other people, the young man who killed some 70 students in Virginia a couple years ago had been committed, and that was an outpatient commitment. It was very expensive, hard to do, did not work in that case, and he became violent. So those stigmas are out there, and that's part of a discussion that we have to think about. But with a 70% negative rating, then if you take on top of that a news item, bias or not, and try to move that from 70 to 1, 72, it's very hard to make the situation worse. That would be, I guess, good news, bad news with regards to that. Now, by focusing attention on mental illness, which is happening, the president has asked for new funding to treat the mentally ill, and that may be good. We certainly need to have more services. Most people who are mentally ill are not getting services, and so that's okay maybe to do that, though it will add expense to our healthcare overburdened system already, but it will help people with their quality of life. And so that may come out of news portrayals about mass shootings and about suicide, homicide that occurs around these events. The other thing that did happen is that Congress decided not to register weapons, decided not to register the mentally ill who may own weapons or not own weapons, and that type of registration will not take place. And I guess from my standpoint, I'm glad for that, because one, I think it would keep people from getting help. Second, these are not the violent people overall who have mental illness. and they are the ones who are suffering wrong from character disorders, personality disorders, overwhelmed by a system. They're not out there to be violent themselves. And of course, third, it would be throwing money away, and we certainly don't want to do that. But there's future endeavors that we need to think about. Let me end in a sense just to talk about what I think is positive, and as I tie together Christianity and medicine, I think that the culture of life that comes from a spiritual dimension to our life is something that counters a culture of death. Jesus characterized himself as light, and wanted us to be light to our community and salt to our community. And there's and death, of course, is often portrayed as darkness or evil or hate, and the opposite being love. So there's a lot to be said about the spiritual model to counter this. I think that people who have in the past, and my classmates talk about this all the time, how we were raised, often inside the church, often again in a culture where the home was more safe place to be. Home is where when you have to go there, they have to take you in. Robert Frost said, an old concept of home. This was a reason to keep on living. There have been a number of increases of suicide in the 35 to 40 or to 64 age group now. This has been in the news lately, and that's a startling statistic. Those are the folks who lost their moorings. They've dropped out of churches. If they belonged, and then they of course now the downturn in the economy, they've lost their jobs, maybe lost their house, and so there's a number of people suiciding who don't have a spiritual home to go to, a church home. So I think there's a dimension there that we want to capture. I want to capture when I talk about Forensic Mondays. I don't think the state can do everything alone. Obviously, taking on the healthcare system has been a big burden for the federal government, and the story is not yet in. But hopefully, and if we go back to the basics with suicide, people are wanting to connect with another person. 15 minutes or less will do it. At least give them hope and give them a chance to back away from committing suicide. And though people do use firearms, very few suicides are actual with firearms. I mean, there are 17,000 deaths with firearms, but there's millions of people, and most of the people are stepping forward and then stepping back and not hurting themselves. So from time to time we'll talk about this in the future, and I would thank you for joining us on our program, Tender Loving Care. I thought that as this article came, this was a good beginning, and there's more to talk about it. So I hope you stay tuned, and special thanks to Channel 3 for the opportunity to come your way each week. Take care.
Stories of a West Virginia Doctor, written by Dr. Harold D. Allman. A collection of 55 short stories about his experience as a small-town doctor in central West Virginia. And Tender Loving Care, Stories from a West Virginia Doctor, Volume 2, written by Dr. Greenbrier Allman, using videotapes to write 70 additional stories of his father's very colorful life as a small-town doctor. They can be found for purchase at Amazon.com and most local bookstores. Tune into Channel 3 Buckhannon for Tender Loving Care with Dr. Greenbrier Allman, where he talks about the connection between Christianity and medicine.